Thanks a lot, Karen. Before I start, actually, can you hear me? Am I turned on? Wide for sound? Great. And I might need to get this on. I just do here. Karen? Yeah? People need to see it. It's not up.
Oh, somebody's turned it off,
Yeah. Projector on.
Yeah. Okay, should be. Must have turned itself on off after a certain time.
Is it coming?
Yeah.
Okay. So before I start, I thought I might just ask, how many of you have actually had or seen a Sense-T presentation? Just put up your hand if you have. Greg, Kathy. Oh, good. At least only 3 of you. I apologise to Kathy in advance because I think you've sat through it about 3 or 4 times. So it's probably going to be, well, I suppose repetition's a fine thing. So I just also want to clarify, we've got about half an hour. Is that right, Karen?
Half an hour, 35 minutes.
Great.
Yeah.
I think it's not coming on.
Let's have a look.
Okay. So just while we start that, look, it's really, it says picture mute. Does that?
No, shouldn't that something to do with it? It was all right early on.
Is detected.
Okay. Yeah, no, the projector's on. Ah.
Is anyone here
Anyone a guru of this particular system, Karen, do you know?
I'm very frightened about pushing things. I might just make it worse.
Yeah, so am I. Yeah, is it on the house PC for the projector?
On, so you put on
I
there.
can't see
Yes,
it.
please.
Yeah. Projector's on.
It's got Electopia.
Is it on the Electopia?
Oh, go back to full over here. So you got the
That's
screen
lighting, isn't it?
That's the lighting.
down. No, the screen's down.
Electopia. Oh, it's
Just go down here. Dark. Go over here.
yes.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, that's got it. Yay! Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
We turn the lights off again now. You've been challenging. How do you turn the lights off?
Yeah.
Dim. Yay! Oh dear. Okay, great. So terrific to be here, and particularly to be with Tia, because Tia is a really important partner in Sense-T, because Sense-T in at least 2 of the 4 projects we're doing are partnering with Tia, in particular Kathy, who's leading the viticulture project, and Richard Rawnsley, who's leading a project around pasture optimisation and animal wellbeing production up on the northwest coast, and Greg, who's just started his PhD in relation to the water project and looking at the impacts of the water project on economic, social and environmental outcomes. So there are many others across TIA who've been involved with Sense-T in its both development and in its implementation. So Sense-T, first thing to say is it's a partnership program, and you can see the partners up there: University of Tasmania, CSIRO, IBM, and the Tasmanian Government. And as you may know, Sense-T actually started with funding from the Forestry Agreement actually, and looking at how do we support diversification in Tasmania's economy, particularly in those areas that are adversely affected by the downturn in forestry. So that's been where some of the connection is. So what is Sense-T? And we're going to obviously talk about this a bit more and in concrete detail, but really what we're looking at doing is how do we use technology to actually transform a whole lot of different parts of our economy by creating a digital view in real-time data, but more importantly how you convert that data to knowledge through combining research excellence with really practical applied outcomes. And that's why T is such a fabulous part of the university to work with, because you guys do this all the time, and particularly having that kind of extension role built in with research development and extension means I think you're really uniquely placed in a way to partner with Sense-T, because that's the sort of world that we're living in all the time, is this crossover between research excellence into how do you actually do applied research and to then support take-up. So let's start with the policy issue as the broad sort of framework for Sense-T. What is the issue that we're really trying to address? And I want to start global and then come down to the micro level. At the global level, what we're really looking at is We have a world that's moving from 7 billion people to 9 billion people by 2050. We know we need to double the amount of food that we actually get to people. Reducing loss in the supply chain would be obviously an important part of that. And at the same time, we've got very serious environmental constraints, including climate change and degradation of environmental assets and our ecosystems. And at the same time, we've got a third of the world's population living on less than $2 a day. So we've got a world population growing, we've got a constraint on growth because of environmental pressures, and at the same time we're trying to create prosperity when a third of the world's population is living on less than $2 a day. So how do you actually do that? And really Tasmania is just a microcosm of that problem, and one that we've kind of had a battle with in terms of our own economic history of development versus the environment. How do we actually create prosperity when we've got an 8.1% unemployment rate, we've got regional communities that are pretty tight and are struggling economically? How do we do that in a way that's environmentally sustainable? That's the challenge that we're looking at, and in some ways Tasmania is just a fantastic place to look at a microcosm of what's a much bigger problem. So how are we actually looking at doing that? As I said, we're looking at building a digital view, if you like, of Tasmania, combining real-time and historical data, and then converting that to knowledge that people can use through the combination of research excellence with applied applications. We always start with this slide because I do a lot of presentations internationally as well, and the first thing we have to establish is where's Tasmania. So hopefully in this audience we don't have to do that. The first thing I want to say is there's nothing new about sensors, and in fact sensors are everywhere in our world already, and many of you I'm sure work with them all the time in terms of agriculture, and farmers are some of the early adopters in fact in relation to sensors. You know, from things like when you put your hand in the lift door and it doesn't close on you, that's a sensor, through to your mobile phone, through to sensors on soil and moisture that farmers are using around irrigation. So they exist everywhere, but the problem that we have is they really, at the moment, they're just doing one job. And in some cases, sadly, even struggling to do that. So, for example, with water, when they introduce water meters, they're being used for billing, but there's no feedback mechanism that's going to the consumer. That's an example of where a sensor asset is doing a job, but only one job. So really where the opportunity is can we combine networks so that sensors can do more than one job? And this is really a key part of the Sense-T design. How do we repurpose data and add value, and so that it can do different jobs? The second really important takeaway for all of this is that data is not enough. In fact, in many ways, the world is awash with data, and we've got a exponentially increasing amount of data in the world. What you really need to be able to do is go up the value chain, convert that data to knowledge, and make it available through easy-to-use apps. And what we're really focusing on is that conversion process and how you can use real-time data to help business, governments and community to make better decisions and to help them do more with less. And really what we're looking at is less cost, less impact on the environment, and a really big issue around less social conflict. And I'm going to come back to that when we talk about water project and potentially the project we're working on, the design at the moment in the aquaculture industry around social licence. So it's a really important issue, but it's got to be user-friendly and easy to use, and that's the key messages that we've had back from any of the end users we're engaging with. It's got to be something that's mobile, easy to use. At the moment, folks, focus on iPads and phones, but really where this technology is going extremely fast is actually wearable technology. For example, Google Glasses, you put it on, it's got augmented reality, and you can actually see. The easier it is to actually interact with the data, the more it's going to get picked up. And I think this has been a really important learning, and one that colleagues from TIA have constantly challenged us on, which is right, is that we have to really make sure that we're not, I think I'm going to use Kathy's words, we're not just doing eye candy, that we're actually designing systems that really help people make better decisions. Don't make the decisions for them. We're talking about decision support systems. So providing easy to feedback information that helps people make better decisions. And I do think that the technology has really shifted. I know particularly in your literature there was a lot of consideration about the use of decision support systems in the late 90s, and that there was a lot of criticism about whether they've actually been taken up. I think what's happening is the technology, and one of the research questions is how do we make sure that the technology we're deploying is such that people really will take it up and use it. The feedback we get constantly from farmers is they've already got a lot of technology, not all of them, obviously there's a curve of those who are early adopters through to those who are a bit slower, but they're really incredibly frustrated at the number of sort of discrete apps out there. And often what's happened at the moment is sensors are combined with a particular type of technology, for example irrigation, where it's vertically combined, and they've got to open up an app in their office on the farm rather than actually have something that's pulling it all together in one place and has multiple uses and is easy to use. So we like to start with this picture of Mike. Mike's a 5th generation farmer, beef and dairy farmer up in the northwest coast, and I think this is a really good example of the sort of new business models that are emerging around environmental sustainability. And I said at the beginning that we're really interested in this big problem about how do you create prosperity in an environmentally constrained world. Now, part of that is actually creating the business models where there are drivers, market drivers, around how products that are produced in an environmentally sustainable way can actually create prosperity. Now, in this rather extreme example, Mike is selling that water at $22.50 a bottle into the eastern seaboard of Australia. He also tells me it's on the New York water markets for this price. And the reason that Mike's able to do this is that he is actually accessing Bureau of Meteorology data that shows that Tasmania has the cleanest air and water in the world, which we do, from the Cape Grim station. But then what he's doing, he's only harvesting water when the wind comes from the south, and then making that information available through his provenance, through his supply chain to consumers. Now, as I say, this is a fairly extreme example, and it upsets our colleagues from the wine industry no end when they see this picture. But this is really what a lot of Tasmanian farmers are doing. They're really trying to capture the value of provenance through market niches by focusing on food safety, food stability, provenance, the conditions under which food's produced. Last week we were up with Peter Greenham up from North West Coast, who does the Cape Grim brand, his abattoir up there. Their biggest market segment, Pete tells us, is growing, is into the US, a brand called Never Ever, which is a kind of standard, if you like, in the US, just slightly less than organic. And in that brand, it's basically never had any hormones, never had any antibiotics, never been in a feedlot, never had grain. And that brand for them is actually a very big market leader, and they're actually now packaging down to cuts and then marketing that into the US. So I think it's obviously a very important area. The other story that we tell in relation to this, Henry Du, who's the head of the Human Interface Technology Lab, now recently appointed up in Launceston, he's Taiwanese and spends a lot of time in China. And he's always saying that in Beijing, the most prestigious childcare centre in Beijing, where all the party officials want to send their kids, is the one where all the food comes from Australia. Not worried about the quality of care, worried about the food. And I think that this is an increasingly big issue globally as we have these sort of constraints I was talking about. People are concerned about the quality and provenance of their food. So let's just dive into SenseT. We started off really as a proof of concept in the first 2 years, and we have 4 projects that are part of that proof of concept. 2, as I said, are with Tia, one up the northwest coast with Richard Ronsley is leading, one that Kathy's leading in viticulture. We have another project in water and co-governance around adaptive water management in the northeast. And the final one we have is in relation to oysters in aquaculture. So 4 projects. And I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the methodology, about how we went around doing these projects, because I think this is quite important. Essentially what we did in all of these projects is said we're going to run a strength-based participatory design model. And so what that meant is we brought together the researchers from the domain areas, so in this case in agriculture, together with the ICT specialists and with the end users. We did 2 by industry. So that was the one in oysters and viticulture, and we did 2 by community, so by a looking at a geographical area. And what we did is we brought folks together and started off the conversation is, first of all, what's worked for you well in research projects in the past? And that was an interesting question. Secondly, what are you really good at? What is your vision for the future? And if SenseT was an opportunity, what would you do? So they were the 4 questions that we asked. And from that, we then came up, in effect, with a design, a workshop outcome that, we encouraged people to focus on a 5 to 10 year vision. And said, okay, well, we can't do all of that, obviously, but it's important to think about where we're going. Let's bring it back to the first 2 years and look at a series of deliverables that can be done within that period, which is combining research with practical outcomes. And that then led the project design. The project leads did the design documents, went back to the end users again, signed off, did budgets and all that sort of thing, and got going. I think this is really, really important because the world is littered by examples of technologies looking for, technological solutions looking for problems to solve. We really wanted to avoid that in this project by actually starting with the end user and inverting the process. And I think this is a really important part of why we've had such strong industry support and engagement, is that people feel genuinely that they have had a very strong say in how the projects are being designed. So I'm going to dive into the aquaculture one because I think this is a kind of concrete example. In some ways it's a little bit further along than the others. So this is Ali. Ali actually works, until very recently, in the Department of Health and Human Services in a program called the Tasmanian Shellfish Quality Assurance Program, with the unfortunate acronym of TASCRAP. That's how it sounds if you say it fast. And Ali's job is actually to make sure that when it rains and we get runoff, it goes into the water. Oysters are filter animals. They collect toxins that is then dangerous for human health. So Ali's job is to protect human health by shutting down harvesting when those conditions exist. And up until the time that we did this project, what Ali had been doing is going through a series of different weather sites. There were loggers that industry had, there were loggers that she had. She'd organised to get the data. She'd ring people up and she'd do a bit of this and make her best guess. And she was necessarily very conservative for very good reason. So what we did is the first deliverable in the project is combine all that data, pull it all into one place, combine it with Ali's decision business rules and with animal physiology, and design a real-time decision support system that makes that whole process a lot clearer and easier. So Ali's prediction, which we're now testing as part of our impact assessment research, is that she'll still have to shut down, but she'll shut down for shorter periods of time. And this is a classic way of how we do more with less, because we have no more water leases, so the only way we can create more jobs and prosperity is by actually getting more product out of the same area. And that's kind of cool, but the next deliverable that we're now working on is actually digitising all the decisions that Ali made for the last 20 years, and she's got fabulous records, combining that with the record of weather, which is the key determinant of shutting down, applying machine learning and doing predictive models. So not only do we close only when we need to close, but we're actually able to say to the industry, we think we're about to shut, so get your product out to market now. And even, 24 hours to 48 hours makes an enormous difference to this industry, because sometimes their shutdowns can be, for a month. And so if they can get product out and to market before that happens, again, another way of doing more with less. And the final deliverable under this project is we're working on biosensors. So these are sensors that sit on the shell of the oyster, measure its heartbeat, and yes, they have one, measure how much it gapes, where it sits in the water column, and it acts as a little environmental sensor. And then we combine that with environmental sensing so that you can actually optimise across both. How do you improve animal productivity at the same time as minimising negative environmental impact? So all of that's kind of cool, but when you go back to Mike, you remember Mike with the bottles of water, the project that Richard's working on up there? Essentially what Mike will be doing is using soil sensors to actually combine this with weather information and other models, particularly around pasture optimisation and sensors that are in milk. And so that sensor that Mike is using around irrigation optimisation, which providing real-time information to him, Ali can also access that data. And 40% of our oysters come up in their formative years out of the Duck River estuary. So in fact, that one sensor can be doing 2 jobs, providing information to Mike, providing information to Ali. But that same sensor can be in fact doing many other jobs, including looking at environmental reporting. There's been strong interest from the fire service about actually building that data into fire risk models, because soil humidity, soil moisture is a key driver in terms of fire risk. That same sensor could also be being accessed by the local kids at the local school. That is around, how do we get kids more involved in ICT and science. So this is the whole opportunity around Sense-T. Yes, sensor technology is cool. Yes, it's very interesting, the research we can do in individual projects, but where the real opportunity for Tasmania is, in fact, can we create a knowledge economy, a knowledge network that brings the power of big data to the community through a shared knowledge asset, with the university playing, in effect, the role of supporting that. Now, I think we won't go about this one in depth. I think we'll leave this one for Mark for another session, because Mark Tamplin's leading this project called Pathways to Market, which is our 5th project. This is part of an Australian Research Council grant called Pathways to Market. And essentially the story about using one data and reusing it for other purposes, that's what this project does. And add to it some more sensing. But essentially when we did those design workshops with all those community and industry groups, they said, look, this is our vision. We want you to focus on production optimisation in the first instance and reducing cost and helping us be more competitive. But really that's only half the picture. What we want to do is be able to achieve brand equity through provenance. And that's what this project really focuses on. We realise that we're collecting a whole lot of data for production optimisation that could be repurposed into stories about the conditions under which food is produced that can then be linked to traceability and food stability models that gives you stories around provenance, food safety, traceability into markets. So I won't go any further because Mark is going to be talking with you around this project. The only final thing I'll say is this project has had a lot of international interest. We have partners from the National University of Singapore, Tsinghua University in Beijing, and the World Bank. And part of it is we're looking at world-first ways of developing real-time natural capital accounting at firm level that can be aggregated and drive national and subnational models in relation to natural capital accounting and environmental reporting. So, in some ways, the really big and interesting thing around Sense-T is really around the business model of how do you make this work at a system level. As I say, all the individual research projects are seriously interesting, but it's the aggregation where the huge opportunity is and where we get a lot of interest. So what this model is showing is how we straddle the research and the applied commercial environment. And so there is an R&D environment. There's 4 levels of that. So there's sensors, information that comes in, that's the hardware, the big data engine where all the data is coming into one place. And you can see there the data custodians. They're owners of data that we're negotiating to let us use their data in this research environment. So Bureau of Meteorology, the PIPWE, Hydro, Tas Irrigation, whole range of data custodians who've agreed to let us access their data and pull it into this environment. And then essentially what you do in the architecture is you create APIs, application interfaces, where researchers can pull that data out and use it for models. And in many cases there's fantastic models in universities. What you're doing is you're in effect supercharging them with real-time data, being able to then create applications that end users can use. So that's all that happens in an R&D environment. But you remember I said at the beginning our vision is to create a sustainable knowledge infrastructure. So it's not the way that we traditionally do research projects where you get some very good technology, you get it out there, you put it in the field, you do the experiment, you write it up and then you decommission. That's never going to work for a model like Sense-T where we're trying to create a sustainable knowledge infrastructure. So it was really important for us that we create value for end users in a pretty quick way, and so that they will invest in keeping those sensors out there. And this was a very important part of the decision in our business model. We want to build a world-first economy-wide sensor network, but we want to do that without ever owning a sensor asset. Very radical idea, but actually really important because, we have many examples where there's, you build and they will come. Well, we're not using that approach. We're using an approach of saying let's work with end users from the beginning, doing research excellence, complying with outcome, creating value so that the end user is willing to pay for the asset, its maintenance, and because they're getting value from the app. So what that means is that we have to straddle this world between research and commercialisation all the time. And that's why we're creating a commercial environment so that people like yourselves can create models, applications that can then be moved over into this commercial environment on an app platform like, kind of Apple-esque platform. But the key thing, and why would we do this, is because the public good of creating that knowledge infrastructure, we need to have that data shared. So if I'm Mike and I'm just accessing my own data about my own farm, fair enough, you know, you don't share data. But the minute Mike actually accesses an app that uses somebody else's data, like the Bureau's data or Te Pipui's data, he has to tick a box that says, yep, I agree that mine will be shared. And that's how we create that community resource of data and can make it open for innovation for people to actually use that data to create value. This is not a simple thing to do. We have 2 people from ABS actually seconded into the program designing the privacy and confidentiality around this, which is quite tricky. So really what you're saying is share the data because we all win, but we promise to protect your privacy. And if we don't do that, then we'll have troubles. And I think a classic example, in fact, I was talking to Richard the other day, last week up in Burnie, and he said, you know, this Overseer project that some of you might have heard about in New Zealand, where they looked at runoff and doing models of runoff to help manage nitrogen, turned into a disaster because the regulator used it to actually push compliance onto the farmers, so people didn't want to use it. So getting the model around utility and privacy and where that balance is in fact incredibly important part of the program design. So why do this? Why do this in Tasmania? Well, it's because we're small enough to capture all this information across a whole economy, but big enough to make it meaningful. We have urban, peri-urban, rural, wilderness. We've got everything. We've got a closed environment. We're dealing with complex systems issues, so you want it to be kind of small. And one of the things we often say is we don't have economies of scale, but we've got economies of scope. We can get people in the same room to actually agree to share the data. We have one university. We're not fighting with each other about who's going to be taking the role in research. You know, it really is an incredibly good place for this sort of approach. But really importantly, and I want to go back to where I started, we are addressing a global challenge, one that has great urgency. And what we're really interested in is, can we find solutions here that not only benefit our community, but actually can be cost effectively scaled elsewhere and taken both nationally and internationally. And that's very much part of where we see the program going over longer term. So that's half an hour on the knocker. I'm very happy to take any questions, comments. There's so much more we could talk about, but I hope it's just given you a sense of the sort of concept. What's really, I find exciting about SenseT is once we explain it to people, I'm just amazed at the number of ideas that folks come up with. Some that will be driven in research organisations, and some where companies and community groups just want to do themselves, and we already have those examples. One of my KPIs is all the ideas we've never actually thought of, but because we're making this available in an open way, that people will actually drive and derive data from it. Derive benefit from it, both for researchers and more broadly.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ross. That was
No worries.
great. Give you a clap first before we yeah, no, that's fantastic, and certainly shows the power of shared data. Questions from people?
Not one. Thanks.
So at the end there, when you were coming back to the international applications, and you know, at the beginning you were talking about the large number of people that live on less than $2 a day, do you think this sort of system, in terms of the application in a developing country, for example, relies on people owning smartphones, which I believe there is a lot of ownership of smartphones, even when people are living on a very low amount of money. But yeah, what are some of the ideas
Around that? Yeah. Look, I think it's really exciting. You know, I've spent 15 years of my life working internationally, most recently working for the World Bank and the UN around pro-poor development in developing countries and global supply chains. And what really completely is very, very clear is that there is a leapfrogging of technology. You know, if you're going to developing countries, everyone has a phone. It's incredible how many people have a phone, really, particularly given the levels of income. And recently we had the Chief Innovation Officer from the World Bank here in Tasmania and was asked the same question. And so I'm going to give you his response. He gave a story about Uganda. Uganda's main crop, 70% of its economy, is actually bananas. Very, very dependent. They got a blight, in banana blight, and what had happened is they didn't know where it was, they didn't know the progression of the disease, and wrong information got out where folks were cutting off the bananas and burying it in the soil because they thought that's what fixed it. So they thought, oh, what are we going to do? They got together with UNICEF, who had an SMS network of 45,000 phone users, sent out a text message to all those users, said, have you seen this in crops near you? They got something like 35,000 responses saying yes. Overnight, put it on a Google map, instantaneously had an incidence of what the amount of disease was across the country. Next text, would you like to know what to do about this? Yes, got 30,000 back of that order. They sent it out. This is what you have to do. All you have to do is wash your knife before you cut from one plant to the other, and that will stop it.
So that's not using sensors?
It is, it's human sensors.
Well,
Yeah, it's human sensors. So the question is using sensors that are not human. I think that visual analytics and using phones for actual images is a part of that. We're really focusing in this project on low-cost environmental sensing. And we have a trial, in fact, which is part of what we're working with Kathy. We have a trial of two types of ways of collecting data. One is by using 3 weather stations and data points, and another is using a data mesh. And part of that research is to drive down the cost of sensing. And I think if we can get the cost low enough, it will actually be able to be deployed. I also think that in many, we've had a lot of discussions with multinationals, food multinationals, who are interested in working in their supply chain to improve productivity, and through those sort of mechanisms that you can actually look at the uptake. Most sensing other than visual, it doesn't take much bandwidth, so you can do it on 3G. It's really the hardware. But the key about sensors, you remember that diagram, those bottom 2 layers of the sensors and the data, in some ways, if you can do that as a common good, then the value is actually in the apps and the end use, and so that you can actually look at reducing the cost so that you can create a more open innovation model. So I think where we're going, the technology definitely is going to make it affordable. We're looking at a program in Indonesia. Anyone here from Indonesia? No. There's a new World Bank AusAid funded project called AKIL, which is around technology for development, and we're looking at doing a partnership program with them around shrimps, actually, because shrimps, when they feed their little jaws go click, 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 and you can actually, we've developed algorithms so that you don't overfeed, which reduces the cost, but also reduces environmental impact, and so that's a big deal in Indonesia. So I think it is very, certainly the reaction we're getting from institutions like the World Bank and IFC is that they see this as being, the future. What we really need to focus on is cost. Yep. Hey, I didn't see you do.
So congratulations on the latest announcement, $10 million
Yep.
for regional development in Tasmania.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it'd be somewhat hypocritical to be clear on where you're going to spend that, given the participatory approaches is your philosophy and a great one. But any sneak previews, any thoughts in the program office, any ideas on how you might deploy that $10 million to optimise regional employment through sensing technology?
Yep. Thanks, Dougal. I should have covered that. The $10 million is part of a cash injection into a CRC bid. The Vice-Chancellor has tasked us in the program office to actually raise $10 million, $100 million, sorry. He said $10 million lacked ambition, I remember his words, so that we would actually raise a much larger amount of funds in the order of $100 million, which, we're a long way down that track, more than half already. So the $10 million will be a cash injection into that to do a CRC bid is the intention, assuming CRCs exist after the next election. Now that CRC proposal, there's an internal reference group of which we've asked Holger for a nominee. It has a number of discrete work packages. Work package 1 is to continue practical projects, and they look at economic, social and environmental, and that includes an extension of the agricultural work that we're doing with TIA. It has other areas as well which I could talk about, but we can come back to that if you're interested. The second work package is all around how do we increase skills to work with big data in regional communities, and from K through to postgraduate. We're really interested in problem-based solving, interdisciplinary research, applied research, and what are the skills we need to make that happen so that that data resource is able to be actually used and optimised, so from kindergarten through to postgraduate. And then there's a work package that's around data analytics, a work package around low-cost ubiquitous sensing, and a work package around impact assessment, looking at economic, social and environmental. Part of our engagement with industry is that we have been working with national and state partners, mainly national, to put up what's called an innovation precinct bid, which we will hear next week, we hope. And part of that is actually how we engage with industry, government and community group to actually drive the research agenda in a way so that we're interacting, and also the commercialisation process. So that's part of how the whole 100 million, if you like, comes together. It's a big job to do this. We're intending to work between now and June next year, when the bid is due, to really mobilise resources. We've started on doing participatory designs for 4 areas. So to go beyond the ones we've already done, and one of those is in aquaculture. We've got one in forestry and traceability, one on biodiversity and carbon markets, which again will involve TIA, and one around the issues of social licence. So, exciting.
That's exciting. Let's
Yeah.
hope they keep CRCs around.
Hey?
Let's hope they keep CRCs around with the policy.
Yeah, look, that's the issue. They survived 2 changes of government already. If they don't, then the plan B is that we look to do it just with the private sector. I mean, we've been extraordinarily successful in raising funds. Our return on investment in the program office is currently running about 1 to 40. And so really what we're looking at doing is how do we use that private sector engagement to do resource mobilisation. It's an ambitious target, but I think one that we can go towards, and we won't be able to make a final decision really till September. But one of the things I really want to say is that the program office is very small. We don't employ a single researcher. We're kind of like a brokerage strategy knowledge infrastructure group that then works with researchers. So our job is actually to raise funds for researchers to work on practical projects with those stakeholders. It's kind of a different model to the way universities normally do it, and it's an experiment in its own right. Can we be more effective in using that sort of approach to mobilise resources from both the private sector and for research like the ARC grant? Yeah.
In your structural model there, you didn't have any links between the researchers and commercial development.
Yeah, there's actually another slide which I can show you which links in the precinct. You're right, it doesn't, and it does. That model is really kind of a mixture of architecture and business model, trying to show the commercialisation part. And yes, you're right, it's not there, but it's a very core part of our design. And in fact, those first workshops that we did together with TIA actually then got distilled into a set of guidelines, and those guidelines for our project design. So these new projects I was talking about that we're scoping, when we do those, we have this kind of approach that's embedded in it with the guidelines about how to do participatory design. Yeah.
And my other comment would be, you also need to think about in your data sharing is the ability for people to have local sharing.
Yes.
Because a lot of the times people are not interested in what's happening on the other side of the state, and may not be willing to share their data with people there, especially if governments can come in and say, oh, you're not doing the right thing, but they may be willing to share with their neighbours.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think that's one of the things. It's really interesting what people are willing to share and what they aren't, because most people don't care about sharing, temperature information, but they care a hell of a lot about what they did with their botrytis model, because that's their competitive advantage. But just reminded me to talk briefly around the water project that we're doing in the northeast that Greg's involved in. Is when we did the participatory design, it was super interesting. We thought we were going to be doing water modelling. There'd been a project that had been operating up there in the southeast for a long time with Cyro. And when we did the workshop with the community, they said, had enough in relation to modelling. What we really are interested in is, can we have access to real-time information to help us manage the health of the river and the way that we manage water resources ourselves as a community? And so what we found out in the design process was that they were already doing it. One farmer would ring the other and say, look, what they're trying to do is avoid the cease to draw order. So, if they draw down too much water, the regulator stops them from doing it and says the issues are cease to draw. So what they're actually doing is ringing each other up. Bob, can you not do the spuds today because I need to do my poppies, and then if we just time this one, we won't draw down and we won't trigger this. Or they'd ring up, Alan up the road and say, can you just release a bit of water because this will even it out and then we'll be okay. And so what that project is doing is looking at what are the environmental flows that are required for the health of the river, and giving the community access to real-time data so that they can actually manage that. It's a super interesting project and one that involves the regulators, both Tas Irrigation and Dipipui, and I think it's going to be one that has potentially a lot of implications in other catchment areas about how do we actually engage the community about collective use of resource. And also one that's this project has had a lot of attention from the World Bank, and it's actually been written into a project in Asia in about 3 years' time, because we said, we're nowhere near ready. Because if we think we have a lot of trouble managing environmental data and regulation in Australia, which we do, I mean we don't even do good environmental reporting in Tasmania, it's going to be really hard for countries like Bangladesh or Nicaragua or places in Africa. So can we come up with different models that empower communities to look at co-governance rather than this traditional model that the government will regulate? And that's a really interesting issue in its own right. That's also the issue around, just coming back to that, about the interest from the bank around this whole approach, because as you may know, in Rio Plus 20 last year, there were 2 key outcomes from that. One was, a critical thing was that the world community says, yes, we must have sustainable development, and the second one is we can't just continue to make decisions as though money is the only thing that matters, is that there are natural resources and natural capital, and if we're just drawing that down, then we're not sustainable. So we need decision-making systems across business and government that actually value the natural resources. So 80-odd countries, 90-odd multinationals say, yep, we're signed up to that. Nothing new about natural capital accounting, it's been around for years, but then they go, oh, how the hell are we going to do this? And part of their interest in Sense T is, if we are successful in creating that knowledge infrastructure I described, and it's still an if, that we can actually create incredibly important public resource with private effort. Because you're focusing on creating value for an end user, like a farmer, or I've only talked about agriculture, but we're looking at projects in mining and logistics and tourism, and you can create that value. You can then repurpose the data to actually do environmental reporting, so that we can actually create a way that's from a value creation approach rather than a cost-driven regulation approach to look at how we do environmental reporting. I mean, that's one of the possibilities.
Yeah, it's amazing. Ros, I wanted to just go further on this, your thought about how you're going to increase the skills. You talked about the resource, and then looking ahead in a CRC, how do you increase the skills around that?
Yeah.
So it's good to have a resource, but I'm wondering if there's any thinking around how communities manage and share their knowledge.
Yeah.
Because that's part of economic, I see it as a key part of economic development.
Yep. Is there thinking? Yes, very early. I mean, we're looking for partners. It's not as though we have the answers in the program office. We're creating something new together. So it's something we want to work together with other folks on. But where this has already come up is in the oyster project, because there is in fact very little known about oyster physiology, and most of that knowledge is actually in the oyster farmers. Their knowledge, their tacit knowledge from the way that they've actually operated. So when we actually brought out a colleague from, I think did we talk about this? She's from Tufts University, who does applied economics research, and she actually did a field visit and designed an experiment which we're looking to implement with IMAS. And part of that was, if you give people access to real-time information, are you in fact giving them the tools of science? Because that they get this feedback instantaneously. And one of her hypotheses is, if you did that, she actually wants to do an experiment where you give the IMAS guys in a lab and the oyster farmers the same problem and see who gets there first. And her hypothesis is, if you give the tools of science, i.e. that you get feedback and can analyse quickly to people, that they will actually be able to combine their tacit knowledge together with that and be able to move faster. And that's just talking about, obviously, one example, but when the impact assessment methodology that we're working on, which David Adams is coordinating, is we're looking, how do you do impact assessment on individual projects? So by giving people the real-time information, do they use it? What is the actual impact on their decision? That's really sort of interesting in its own right. But what we're very interested about is, if one of our key hypotheses is that by giving access to real-time information, we can create a knowledge economy so that the sum is greater than its whole, and that you get transformative change in a regional economy, how do we track that? And I think that's more in the line of the question you're asking. A very hard thing to do, but it is part of the research agenda. We've been really clear since we started with Sense-T that you have to invest in impact assessment. I don't think we've been particularly great at it yet. We're still struggling to get it really operational. David Adams from the Regional Development Business Faculty is coordinating it now, which is great. And that's one of the things we really want to look at, the impact of individual projects, but how do they combine to make a difference? Can we build a knowledge economy? How does that transform communities? And what's the role of universities and research organisations in communities once you adopt this different model? So, as I say, I certainly wouldn't pretend we've cracked it. We haven't. I think we've articulated the problem. For any of you who are interested, we've actually done a program logic design where we tried to put this in a schematic way about and identify the actual research questions. And this will go to the academic senate as part of our engagement with the university, saying, well, these are some of the research questions. Now, one of the research questions is, do decision support systems work, and why do they work and why don't they? And what are the implications of the way that we design user interfaces to make them more effective and get better take-up?
You did touch on this on passing, but can you speak a little more about how some of these will affect biodiversity outcomes in terms of providing better information for biodiversity conservation?
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised that because I really like that particular topic myself. One of the projects we're doing the participatory design on is emerging carbon and biodiversity markets. And the way that we're thinking, we're working with Greening Australia, CSIRO, TR, the Future Forestry, Centre, lots of other folks in departments. And basically what we're thinking about doing is in biodiversity, looking at how we can measure biodiversity in real time. The forest industry has proposed to us, as part of FSC certification, they have to show how they're making progress in managing biodiversity. So one of the ideas we're working in a scoping process is to say, can we put sound chips in a coop, match it with the bird voices that we have. I have a library of complete bird voices at the university, and use that as a biodiversity proxy. You can also do the same thing with frog calls. I understand there's whole lots of different ways of doing that. And then actually monitor, say, a logging event in a coop to see how it affects biodiversity, how quickly it recovers, can you change practices to get better outcomes. Greening Australia is very interested in corridors in agricultural areas, same sort of thing, same principle, just applying a different model. And so that's one of the very specific projects we're looking at. Thinking is both carbon and biodiversity markets are going to become increasingly important, and can we get methodologies as such to measure it? It's one of the things we know about markets. Markets only operate if you can give it reliable information. So we need to find cost-effective, reliable information and ways to do that. Just a very cool idea on that as well is that one of the ideas that was suggested to us by local communities, not only doing it to do that purpose of biodiversity markets, but then create an augmented reality bird watching app so that you can create tourism value. And this is this key whole idea about how you repurpose data so you can have data collected for one purpose but use it for another that creates value.
Ros, you mentioned earlier that you had 2 per industry, so there's 4 streams and 2 per industry as part of this.
The new CRC proposal you're talking about?
Yeah, well, this whole Sense-T, you said you're going out and actually setting up.
Oh, you mean the new 4 that we're scoping?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you sort of go in and tell us about what are the 2 per industry? So there'd probably be 8 streams.
No, maybe I misexpressed it.
2 by region.
2 by industry.
Oh yeah, when the first 4,
yeah.
we were wanting to experiment with how to do effective design. So we did participatory design for 2 by industry, which was viticulture and oysters, and then we did 2 in a geographical area which involved the whole community. And we were essentially wanting to trial the participatory design and look at the different sort of outcomes we got from that methodology with a different approach. And I'm glad we did that. It was really interesting, particularly the one up the northwest, because it was the first time dairy, beef and oyster and cropping had been together. Because we tend to relate to people in industry subsectors, and they had never actually been together. And we also had the council, the NRM, the ag extension services like Survey and schools, and they all came into the same participatory design. And it was really interesting because there was a little bit of tension between the oysters and the dairy farmers, as you can imagine, because there's a lot of runoff, and so up there they suffer the biggest closures in oysters. But what was really interesting is they had to identify like their 3 key priorities. So production optimisation was the easy first one. Then the second one was pathways, which we responded to with that ARC design. The third is that they wanted to make the Duck River, wanted to convert it from being the dirtiest river in Tasmania to the cleanest. And I don't think we cracked that one. That's on the agenda, but that was their 3 priorities. And I think that wouldn't have happened unless you got them all together. It was an interesting discussion.
So, and you actually defined the projects that will
The
be...
new ones?
Yeah.
We have, under our grant agreement, we had 4 that we had to scope, and that's what we're doing now. And so the expectation would be that we would then do resource mobilisation for those. Now, some of that might be going into a CRC, some of it might be we can do a linkage grant, or we could put it to a regional development corporation, or we could put it to a DAC funding round. So in some ways what we're trying to do is optimise the money for research, and some of it's the option of going back into CRC, but some of it might be saying, okay, if this is our overall strategy, can we put a little bit of this in different ways? So it's still pretty open, and that's why we formed this internal university reference group to talk about how do we then take this forward. So we've probably identified 4. In the CRC concept, we thought we should do 40 over 5 years, but that's an average. But we will ration. There is no shortage of ideas. We will ration by the level of commitment from the end users. Now, in the case of commercials, it would be, are they willing to co-invest? So, for example, in aquaculture, we could put in 10,000 for the design. The industry has put in 10,000. So we wouldn't even do the design unless they were willing to stump up the money, because our objective is to get applied research outcomes. If they're not even interested enough to pay for scoping, you're never going to get their buying down the back. So that doesn't apply to all, because some projects are for community or for government, and they don't have money in the same way, so it's a different test. And we're going to have to balance that.
That oyster example.
Yeah.
Is that, when you're getting live data, possibly when the oysters are harvested, is the network such that an end user, like your customer, could actually get that data and see the quality, or is that just too far?
I think that's where, that is where people want to go. That's not where we are now. I think we've got some time before we get there, but that is the intention where folks would actually go. Can I just talk about the salmon one, which I think is a really interesting example? At the moment, the regulator, every one of these projects, by the way, when we talk to communities, often they identify the regulator as their biggest priority, which is kind of interesting. And so, but in salmon, at the moment, just to give you an idea, in all of the, when you have a licence area for nets, for salmon farming, they have to do this environmental reporting. It's currently done manually, and they produce a report like this, literally in paper, sort of 8 inches deep, and they deliver it to the department. The department, for all its best endeavours, has limited capacity to deal with all of that. So really what we got the industry together is what they've said they want to do is if we can do that in real time into a common repository, and we do 3 different research projects with apps that come out of them. One is, can we do like oysters and give the regulator a decision support system that interprets in real time so they can actually do something meaningful with it and get better environmental outcomes. The other is to actually look at production optimisation and provenance in the way that you're describing. And the third is actually social licence. One of the biggest concerns is the expansion of Macquarie Harbour fishing, is how that will impact on the World Heritage Area. And so we're talking with the industry, the idea they're scoping, so it's only scoping, is to do real-time art installations that are driven by data. So for example, you can have light installations, art installations that show you oxygen rates in the water that's actually dry. This is apparently being done in New York. The thinking is, can we make information more easily available in an ambient form, but can we also create a tourism value? And so this whole sort of idea of collect it once and use it many times, and then open up the data and let other people create value from it, is that this is how we're trying to think about these projects, is how do we look at that kind of systems level approach. So they're still doing the design, I hasten to add.
Okay.
Surely you're sick of it now.
Yes, Ross, you've been talking practically non-stop for an hour, so I think we should let you go now and just thank you for a really fascinating talk. It's so difficult always to have that vision of 10, 20 years down the track and to be able to be doing things at the moment, but to looking down in that sort of aspect of time. But it's fascinating.
Yeah, it is really fascinating. Thank you for your time. I really hope that we get to work with many of you over the years going forward. I mean, we know it's an ambitious agenda, but I think it's also one where we're looking at incrementally building it. There will be failures and there will be successes, but the key is, really working together. And if we do it well, I think it can position this university in a really unique space and be a tremendous resource to researchers in terms of academic outcomes as well as applied outcomes in our community. So thanks very much. I look forward to working with you.
Okay, and drinks and nibbles upstairs.